Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Huge drama going into the Mexico City Grand Prix. McLaren have officially dropped the repercussions on Lando Norris after what happened in the first lap of the sprint last time out in Austin. A clean slate, they say, for the rest of the season between their drivers. Will that change if there's any drama happening between their two men this upcoming weekend, or is their intention to simply hold off Max Verstappen at all costs? We also have major drama on the budget cap emerging today. It's become clear that at least one team is in serious trouble with the FIA. Which team might that potentially be? Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Not sure I'll be able to do a video tonight after practice because it's very late. So I thought I'll do one this morning because there's a lot going on. We're going to start just briefly with Sergio Perez. Of course, it is the Mexican Grand Prix. He will be in Imola in a Ferrari next month in the SF23 doing some prep for his return in Ferrari power with Cadillac next year. But let's talk about this cost cap stuff. Of course, this isn't for this year. This is for last year. Now, what's interesting about this is that usually over 2023, 2024, the teams have been told in early September, certainly in September, that everything for last year was perfectly clean, perfectly fine. But in 2022, after the 2021 season, where Red Bull and the catering and all this, they had a little bit of an issue that got delayed. But of course, that was the first year. So we didn't really know when the expected date was. But over the last couple of years, it's become relatively clear that if nothing is said in September, then we better watch out. And that's what John Noble says, that they've run unusually late this year with these cost cap compliance certificates, nice alliteration, and as a result it's fueled some serious rumours. And then shortly afterwards, Planet F1 and Thomas Maher over there say that Aston Martin have committed a minor procedural breach of the cap. So, look, you'd have thought by year 4, year 5 of the cost cap, the teams would have figured out the procedures. But it's clearly a very complicated thing. I don't know what they've submitted slightly wrong, in what order or whatever, who knows. But, you know, we know that these minor breaches and then there's major breaches. This is a procedural breach, so it doesn't seem like they spent too much, but they did something wrong and they're going to have to pay some sort of a fine. The key thing, though, is, as they describe, a rival team is understood to have committed a substantial breach. Now, this is fascinating because presumably these journalists know who it is. I mean, they know that Aston Martin is a minor breach, so presumably they know, or at least they've heard. Look, I have no idea. Of course, there's various sources saying all sorts of different stuff. There are plenty of theories as to who it might be. You would think, of course, that it is a team that was at least reasonably competitive, or a team that had a load of crash damage. That's one theory, is that it's Williams. I think it was even said by James Vowles at some point last season that, bloody hell, lads, if we keep crashing these cars, we're in a potential problem here. So I don't know exactly about that, because we know that Williams did have a lot of damage to deal with towards the end of last season. They won last year's Destructors Championship, that is for sure. So that's one other option. Of course, the other discussion is whether, given McLaren had obviously heightened competitiveness, people are talking about them. We know that some teams like to ride the line a little bit more so than others. So really, who knows? But apparently the other team is looking to challenge the decision. Again, if it was to hypothetically be Williams, they might say, well, look, what could we really do, right? We spent this money and our boys put it in the wall and we had to repair it. So I don't know. I'm just obviously speculating here. But it is nonetheless very interesting that, again, cost cap is a talking point, and I'm sure that it will continue to be so. So Aston Martin, minor breach. There are 9 other teams to speculate on which other team may have had a major breach. They do describe, I mean, Thomas Maher describes them as a rival. I don't really think that means anything, but just thought I'd throw it out there anyway. But let's talk about some of the things that were said in Media Day last night, because there was a lot going on. This is a pretty funny quote. I mean, it's kind of cold, I guess. Colapinto says, history is not written by cowards, when asked to comment on his move on Pierre Gasly, which was controversial. The team weren't especially a big fan of that. But I'm sure that Briatore would be in line with a quote like this. But look, this would go hard if it was an overtake for second or for third or for a podium. If they told him to hold position for third or fourth or something, and he went for the move to get his podium, then yeah, this quote applies. When it's a move for 17th, I don't really think it goes quite as hard. But still, I think it gets the point across that Colapinto is not willing to back down from any challenge this season. We also got some word from Isaac Hadjar, a pretty nice picture at the top here with Yuki in the background. Yuki actually apologised to Racing Bulls because, he went on that bit of tirade last weekend against Liam Lawson saying that he's always trying to ruin his laps. Maybe there's some truth in that, but also maybe Yuki's seeing ghosts at this point because he just thinks that Lawson's out to get him or whatever. But Yuki actually apologised for that. And then Hadjar, who we think is probably getting Yuki's drive next year, went on to say, when you've got Max as a teammate, I don't think there's a better reference. It's definitely a bit frightening, but at the same time, it really excites me to one day be his teammate. So I think Hadjar's pretty confident that that may well be happening, saying that, well, a bit scary going up against Max, but I'm excited to give it the challenge, I suppose. Seems at the moment like only a matter of time until that may well happen. But let's talk about the McLaren stuff. The first drama is on Tapegate. So we talked about this a few days ago. If you guys are unfamiliar, there's a little piece of tape that Norris likes to use to help him line up better in his grid box at the start of the Grand Prix. And Red Bull thought, well, if we tamper with that tape or something, we will affect Lando's start in a negative way. Now, it's been known by McLaren that Red Bull have been trying to mess around with this for some time. So, and Red Bull tried it again last time out in Austin. Now, the article that the race put together on this is pretty funny. It is understood that some of the tactics McLaren employed to make it harder for Red Bull to remove the tape included cutting it into long vertical strips so it couldn't be removed in one go, which is a pretty good idea, and leaving a mechanic on the grid in front of the tape until very late, with Red Bull doing the same to try to remove it anyway, which of course is eventually why they got done with the €50,000 fine. Not because they tried to remove the tape, but because they were where they shouldn't have been when they shouldn't have been there. At one stage, McLaren also put 2 layers of tape on the wall in case the top one did get quickly removed, with the second layer reading, "Better luck next time." So, I don't know, they'd got a Sharpie or whatever and they'd written this. You'd have thought if you put 2 pieces of tape on top of one another, if you remove one, the other one will come off underneath. Maybe not, I don't know. But still, McLaren have known that Red Bull have been trying to do this for some time. The funny thing about it is that Lando says that it's just not really relevant. These are all fun and games. And Lando says, or Max says, before we discuss Lando, we didn't get fined because of the tape. It's just a silly thing that's been going on for a while, and it's not something I pay attention to because I focus on my own parking in the box, he says, which is pretty funny. Because, and I know he also did comments, people have been roasting Lando, haven't they? Because they've been like, damn, you're meant to be a top Formula 1 driver, you can't even park in your grid box, you need a piece of tape on the wall. Look, he doesn't need it. It's a nice to have because you can see the yellow line in your peripheral that helps you line up properly, but it's kind of a thick yellow line, right? So I guess the idea is with the tape, you can be very precise in your measurements. And, well, Max goes on to say, you've got a yellow line on the grids, no? So he's kind of saying, like, why does this cloud use tape, right? I think that's kind of what Max is getting at. But he says, look, you look at it, you park the car, okay, other drivers have their own way of doing things, fair enough, but it didn't have anything to do with the tape, the fine. I mean, it did, but it didn't, if you know what I'm saying. George also, I thought, was pretty funny because there's been lots of comments on sportsmanship and all this and whether it's fair or it's not fair to remove the tape. But George is also on board. Look, as I've said, I would love George to be in a title fight, especially with Max, but at some point soon, because we're going to see what Hamilton has to say on a second on the McLaren pairing and what they need to do to fend off Max. It's very clear that if push comes to shove, Russell would be, let's say, cutthroat, in Hamilton's words, to get the job done. And Russell agrees. He's like, yeah, damn right. If I saw Lando with a bit of tape on the wall, I'd be peeling that off. Why not? If it's a nicely straight painted wall, I'd probably take it off as well. So this tweet was doing the rounds yesterday, and I think for good reason. And Lando says, look, it was no big deal. We already knew that they would try. They tried to take it off and failed. So it's a double punch, right? They failed to get it off the wall anyway. They got a penalty for it. So he says it's pretty funny. So I thought it was a pretty funny reaction to everything, all things considered. Speaking of those Hamilton comments, he mentions this with regard to Max. It's interesting for Hamilton, right? Because if Max does win this title, he then wins 5 consecutive. Of course, there would be talk about 2021 in those scenarios, but, only Schumacher's been the only one to do that. Hamilton's record of 7 with Schumacher would then be getting eaten into seriously by Max, right? Look, there was a time in early 2024 when it seemed inevitable that Max was going to win 5 straight, including 2025. Then that started to become less clear, and it looked like Max was going to go back to number 33 next season. But maybe not, we shall see. But also, Hamilton is the most recent McLaren world champion still, which eventually that record will go, of course. But, maybe on some level Hamilton would still like to hold on to that. So look, I don't really think he cares who wins at the end of the day. Russell was also asked the same thing. He was told, who do you want to win? Russell was like, I don't care, right? I just want to try and win this Grand Prix this weekend, which I think is also fair enough. But Hamilton, I think, gives fair advice to the two McLaren drivers. Effectively, he says, look, lads, you've got to lock in. If you want to beat Max, you've got to lock in. We know how cutthroat, I think is a good word for it, Max will get when it demands it, right? We know what happened in Mexico last year. Max realised the only way that I lose this title is if Lando closes in points. So I will do whatever it takes, illegal or not illegal or whatever, to force Lando out of the way, make sure he doesn't score as many points as he could. And that is how it ended last year, right? We saw what happened on track in Austin. We saw what happened in Mexico. Max did whatever it took to make sure that Norris did not make that title comeback. Would Piastri or Lando do the same thing to Max if the situation demanded? We'll see. But Hamilton knows what that's like, competing against Max in a very much head-to-head title scenario. And Hamilton knows that Max was not yielding an inch in any Grand Prix up until Silverstone in 2021. And then, Hamilton, I think on some level at least, decided he needed to take matters into his own hands. Will the McLaren drivers be willing to do so? Hamilton says you've got to be cutthroat. That's what Max is. He's going to take it from them if they don't do the same. So Hamilton's like, look, you've got to race him back hard. You can't just afford to yield and let Max keep closing in the points. They've got to push. You've got to dig deep to hold off Max because he's obviously on a bit of a charge. He also described how the consistency of Max is very high at the moment. The fact that it's easier to be the hunter than to be the hunted, right? When you're defending a lead, it's a bit more concerning than it is when you're attacking and you've got effectively nothing to lose. So that's also, I think, why Oscar feels like he's struggling a little bit at the moment. There's also an element of these tracks last year he also didn't have a great time on, and as I said yesterday, he was 8th in 23, he was 8th in 24 in Mexico, so he'll need to do a hell of a lot better than that this time around. But the big drama in Austin really was this lap 1 incident of the sprint, right? This is a great shot because you've got Max Verstappen just flying off into the distance, eventually winning the sprint and the Grand Prix, and you've got the two McLaren drivers out of the sprint on the very first lap. Now, this incident, I think pretty much everyone agrees was Piastri's fault in large part. The switchback was a perfectly admirable attempt had there not been 17 cars behind you, but on the first lap of the race, especially in Austin at turn 1, there's always going to be a car on the inside. I think it was just poor awareness for Piastri to attempt to go for something like that. And, well, it wasn't Lando's fault, was it, right? So I think definitely a lot of the blame here should fall on Piastri. I saw Jolyon Palmer did his analysis video. He thought it was more of a racing incident, but most of the comments thought that it was Piastri's fault. Look, whatever you think, McLaren clearly think that it was Piastri's fault. Now, even then, McLaren still said in their discussion here that we believe that Alonso and Hülkenberg could have been more prudent, right, in their decision-making turn 1. But they have decided to allay the repercussions on Lando. Now, of course, this is an absolute mess, but before Media Day yesterday, there was a McLaren insider who spoke to the Daily Mail and had said that they had wiped the slate clean. We have re-examined what happened in the sprint in Austin. There was a good part of my responsibility, says Oscar. That was, of course, when it turned out to the press conference. But the McLaren insider said there have been constructive talks and wiping the slate clean was decided to be the best way forward. We have a common adversary. And I think this is also kind of fair, right? Like, McLaren is such a mess and the repercussions should never have happened in the first place. But I do get the logic here to say, look, if it was just the two McLaren drivers and if Lando had punted Oscar out of the way, then yeah, maybe he takes a repercussion or something. But given Max is in the fight, it's now, let's not put our own guys at war, right? And they should have never done this in the first place, obviously. It was outrageous to put repercussions on Lando, I think, after what happened back in Singapore. But, they maybe have done the right thing. It's taken a roundabout way to get to this point. And what I really hope is that they don't try and do this again. I mean, look, imagine if Lando or maybe Oscar now hits into Lando in Mexico this weekend and costs him a place or something. Let's say kind of what happens back in Monza last year or whatever happens again, then what are you going to do? Put repercussions on him, right? Like, you just got to end it now. You've got to also recognise the drivers won't want to deal with this because they've also got to look at Max in their rearview mirrors. So I think the McLaren have come to the correct conclusion, but like the way that they've come to this point is embarrassing. Like, imagine their car was Alpine level bad. They would be getting clowned on week in, week out with this approach. But anyway, You've got a common adversary. Stopping him, Verstappen, is the main priority. Both drivers know the framework that governs how they drive in the team. This is not rigid, depends on the demands of every situation. Both drivers are happy with the resolution, which I think is fair, right? I mean, and they were expected to declare peace in the interviews. Lando was actually asked about it, and Oscar mentioned that there were no repercussions, and Lando gave this little like smirk, he gave this little laugh or whatever. So I thought that was pretty funny. Like Lando clearly knows that it was Oscar's fault, I think, back in Austin. Look, I think it was a racing incident. Even by McLaren's own admission, it was a racing incident in Singapore. So one might argue that, oh, well, hang on a second, how did Lando get repercussions for that? But now Oscar's not getting repercussions. All of a sudden, it's the slate is clean or whatever. Look, they've done the right thing here. Wipe the slate clean. Let's not bother with any, oh, he gets to choose whether I go out first in qualifying or any of this BS that they might have been playing around with. Let the boys race. They've got Verstappen to deal with. Remove the repercussions, remove the consequences, and it seems that both drivers are happy with this, and I think as well they should be, right? I don't think Oscar, does he really want to, I mean, look, if he wins the championship, he wins the championship, right? But do you really want to win the championship on some, not some technicality exactly, but like your teammates, you get to choose if you get a toe from him or not because he did this at this Grand Prix. Like, I don't really think you want to be messing around with that as a driver, right? You just want to go out there and try and do the best job you possibly can. So the McLaren boys, I wouldn't say they're free to race. I mean, they are, but, you know, the team is still going to employ papaya rules to a certain degree, don't crash into one another. That is the idea, and that's now not happened that often this season, to be honest. But I think this is the correct decision, and it means that Max at least has something to think about. The McLaren boys intending, at least, to not trip over one another anymore, because the reality is that the reason why Max has gained so much ground is because they keep tripping over one another. Certainly in Austin, that was an example. And Max gained a ton of points as a result. So that's the McLaren situation. Is it the right call? Probably yes. Is it the right way that they came to this decision? Probably no. But intrigued to your thoughts as always in the comment section below. Just one final thing was pretty interesting here. De Kester talks about the fact that there is still a good handful of tracks where Piastri is not quite there yet. He says the same thing was true for Verstappen, Leclerc in their third years. Their fourth year, they made a big step in this regard. But it is interesting because it's happening for Piastri at a difficult time. Mexico will be critical this weekend. So intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Just one final thing to mention. George Russell said after Austin that the racing nowadays is not great because mainly because of the tyres, they just don't degrade really in the way that they should, and it's a race to turn one. It's a qualifying championship, it's a race to turn one. There's a reason why turn one is so important, because people are trying to get ahead, because once they're there they will remain. Also, the delta between the cars is relatively slim, so actually getting an overtake done is so challenging. So Russell made this point. The question is he right? You know, do the numbers actually imply this? And Rakesh69 puts this together. And well, this is what we have, right? And it's pretty clear. Now, there are some outliers, but if you look this season at the leader after the first lap and the leader of the Grand Prix after all the laps, almost always that's been the same, right? Now, in Saudi, Max got a penalty, Piastri won. In, of course, Silverstone, Piastri got a penalty, Norris won. So if you consider those as like outliers, then it's only Miami. Max was leading after lap 1. Piastri won the Grand Prix. Everything else, Norris, Piastri, Max, Piastri, etc. I mean, you go through all of it. Canada, Russell led after lap 1, won the Grand Prix. Imola, right? Max led after lap 1 after the amazing overtake, won the Grand Prix. Great Britain, as we saw. Hungary, I mean, even then, Leclerc, if it wasn't for Ferrari messing up the floor levels and having to raise all of the levels of the car so it didn't destroy itself, you know, maybe they could have even won that. Italy, of course, was different in Monza. But apart from that, it's basically just been the same story. So, you know, this may well continue. It means that qualifying is very critical. But, well, in Mexico, do you really want to qualify in pole? That's also a question. So intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.